In a quiet little neighborhood where everything seemed picture-perfect, life moved at a slow and peaceful pace. The streets were lined with neat sidewalks, colorful flower beds, and perfectly trimmed hedges. It was the kind of place where people waved hello to each other in the mornings and kept their lawns looking like they belonged on the cover of a gardening magazine. But beneath this idyllic surface there was one simmering rivalry that everyone secretly whispered about. On one side of the street lived Ben, a cheerful and easygoing man in his mid-30s who worked as a graphic designer from home. Ben loved his house, especially the big old oak tree that stood proudly in his front yard. This wasn't just any ordinary tree. It had been there for decades, long before Ben moved into the neighborhood. Its sprawling branches provided shade during hot, summer days, created a cozy spot for reading under its leaves, and gave birds a safe haven to build nests. To Ben, it felt like part of the family, a symbol of stability and nature's beauty right outside his door. Across the street lived Karen, a woman whose name had become synonymous with busybody among the neighbors. Karen was known for being overly involved in every tiny detail of the community. She chaired the Homeowners Association, HOA, which meant she spent most of her time making sure everyone followed the rules she often interpreted quite strictly. Whether it was checking if someone's mailbox color matched the approved palette, or sending passive-aggressive notes about lawn maintenance, Karen thrived on control. Her own property was immaculate. Not a single weed dared to grow in her flower. Beds and her shiny red convertible always sparkled in the driveway. While Ben enjoyed his laid-back lifestyle, Karen prided herself on perfection. And unfortunately for Ben, Karen had taken particular issue with his beloved oak tree. For months now, she'd been dropping hints, and sometimes outright complaints, that the tree was causing problems. According to Karen, its branches hung too low over the sidewalk, making it difficult for pedestrians to pass underneath without ducking. Worse still, she claimed the falling leaves ended up in her carefully curated flower beds, ruining her hard work. Every time she saw Ben, she brought up the topic, urging him to trim the tree, or better yet, cut it down entirely. Ben tried to be patient. He explained to Karen that the tree was healthy and posed no real danger. In fact, he argued it added character to the neighborhood and offered environmental benefits like providing oxygen and sheltering wildlife. He even offered to regularly rake up any stray leaves that drifted onto her property. But none of this satisfied Karen. To her, the tree was an eyesore and a nuisance, and she couldn't understand why Ben refused to see things her way. The tension between them grew steadily worse. At first, Karen stuck to formal channels, filing official complaints with the HOA board. When those didn't yield results, she resorted to leaving anonymous notes in Ben's mailbox, criticizing the state of his yard. Some days she would stand by her window glaring across the street as though willing the tree to disappear through sheer force of will. Ben, meanwhile, tried to ignore her antics, focusing instead on enjoying his peaceful corner of the world. But Karen wasn't the type to give up easily. Over time, her frustration turned into something more personal. She began seeing the tree as a direct challenge to her authority, not just as the head of the HOA, but as the unofficial queen of the neighborhood. If Ben wouldn't listen to reason, then maybe drastic measures were needed. Little did anyone know Karen was already plotting her next move, oblivious to the chaos it would unleash. As the weeks went by, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted ever so slightly. Neighbors started noticing the icy glares exchanged between Ben and Karen whenever they crossed paths. Conversations around backyard barbecues inevitably veered toward the ongoing feud, with some siding with Ben and others sympathizing with Karen's desire for order. No one could have predicted what was coming next, a chain of events that would leave the entire community talking for years to come. And so, life in this otherwise serene suburb carried on, with tensions quietly bubbling beneath the surface. Unbeknownst to everyone, the stage was set for a dramatic showdown, one that would involve power tools, a very large tree, and a very expensive car. What happened next would test the limits of patience, pride, and perhaps even karma itself. On a bright and sunny Saturday morning, the kind of day when most people were either enjoying a lazy breakfast or tending to their weekend chores, Karen decided it was time to take matters into her own hands. For weeks, maybe even months, she had stewed over Ben's refusal to deal with the tree problem. In her mind, it wasn't just about aesthetics or convenience anymore. It had become personal. Every time she looked out her window and saw that towering oak casting its shadow over the street, she felt a surge of irritation. To her, it represented everything wrong with Ben. His stubbornness, his disregard for rules, and his unwillingness to conform to what she believed was best for the neighborhood. That morning, while Ben was away visiting family, Karen hatched a plan. She didn't bother consulting anyone, not the HOA board, not her husband, and certainly not Ben himself. After all, why should she? She was convinced that the tree posed a legitimate hazard, despite Ben's assurances to the contrary. And if no one else was going to do anything about it, then it was up to her to step in and restore order. With determination burning in her eyes, she marched into her garage and retrieved her husband's chainsaw, a tool he rarely used but kept around for emergencies. Karen wasn't exactly experienced with power tools. Sure, she'd seen them used, on TV shows and YouTube videos, but handling one herself was a completely different story. Still, she figured it couldn't be that hard. How difficult could it be to cut down a tree? Armed with the chainsaw and a vague sense of confidence, she strode across the street toward Ben's yard. Her heart raced as she approached the massive oak, its thick trunk looming above her like some ancient guardian of the land. For a brief moment, doubt flickered in her mind. What if someone saw her? What if something went wrong? But she quickly pushed those thoughts aside. This was for the good of the neighborhood, she told herself. Besides, by the time anyone found out, the deed would already be done. Standing at the base of the tree, Karen revved the chainsaw to life. The loud whirring noise startled a few birds, perched in the branches, sending them fluttering away in alarm. A couple of neighbors peeked out their windows, curious about the commotion. Some recognized Karen immediately and exchanged knowing glances. No one stepped outside to intervene, though. Whether it was because they assumed she had permission or simply didn't want to get involved, they watched silently as she began hacking away at the trunk. At first, progress was slow. The chainsaw struggled against the dense wood, and Karen had to stop frequently to adjust her grip or wipe sweat from her brow. It was harder work than she'd anticipated, and her arms quickly grew tired. But she refused to give up. Each cut brought her closer to her goal, and she imagined how satisfying it would feel to finally rid the neighborhood of that monstrous tree. She envisioned the praise she'd receive from her fellow HOA members, the admiration of her neighbors, and the smug satisfaction of proving Ben wrong once and for all. What Karen failed to notice, however, was the subtle warning signs all around her. Deep inside the tree's core, years of hidden rot had weakened its structure. From the outside, it appeared strong and sturdy, but beneath the surface, decay had eaten away at its integrity. As Karen continued cutting, small cracks began forming near the base of the trunk. The tree groaned softly, a faint creaking sound that might have gone unnoticed amidst the noise of the chainsaw. Had she paid attention, she might have realized the danger she was in. But Karen was too focused on her mission to care. All she could think about was finishing the job. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the air became palpable. The tree swayed slightly, its massive weight shifting ever so subtly. Leaves rustled nervously in the breeze as if sensing the impending disaster. Nearby, a squirrel darted out of its nest and scurried down the trunk, disappearing into the underbrush. Even the sunlight filtering through the branches seemed to dim, casting eerie shadows across Karen's face. Yet none of this registered with her. Oblivious to the mounting peril, she pressed on, fueled by a mix of frustration and misguided determination. By now, a small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk, drawn by the unusual sight of Karen wielding a chainsaw. Some whispered among themselves, speculating about what she was doing. Others snapped photos or recorded videos with their phones, unsure whether to laugh or call for help. A few brave souls ventured closer, calling out to Karen to stop, but she either ignored them or dismissed their concerns with a wave of her hand. In her mind, she was doing the right thing, saving the neighborhood from a potential hazard. Why couldn't anyone else see that? The final moments before the catastrophe unfolded felt almost surreal. The chainsaw bit deeper into the trunk, carving out another jagged gash. Suddenly there was a loud snap, the unmistakable sound of wood giving way. Time seemed to freeze as everyone held their breath, watching in stunned silence. Then, with an ominous groan, the tree began to tilt. Its massive branches swayed wildly, and the ground trembled beneath its weight. Karen froze, her eyes widening, in horror as realization dawned on her. For the first time since she started cutting, Karen truly understood the magnitude of what she had done. But it was too late to undo it. The tree was falling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. As the massive oak tree began its inevitable descent, time seemed to stretch unnaturally. The air was thick with tension, and the only sounds were the creaking of wood and the panicked gasps of onlookers. Karen stood frozen in place, her chainsaw still buzzing loudly in her hands as if mocking her predicament. Her mind raced, trying desperately to process what was happening. She had envisioned this moment so many times in her head, cutting down the tree, proving Ben wrong, earning the admiration of her neighbors, but never like this, never with such chaos and destruction unfolding before her eyes. The tree groaned again, louder this time as gravity took hold. Its branches scraped against each other, creating an eerie symphony of snapping twigs and splintering bark. Leaves fluttered wildly, caught in the turbulence of the falling giant. And then, with a deafening crash, the tree hit the ground. Or rather, it didn't. Instead of collapsing harmlessly onto the street or even into Ben's yard, the oak tilted precariously toward Karen's driveway across the road. It was almost poetic irony. The very thing she had sought to eliminate was now barreling straight toward her prized possession, her shiny red convertible. For a split second, Karen considered running. She glanced over her shoulder at the car, her heart pounding in her chest, but her legs refused to move, rooted to the spot by sheer disbelief and terror. Before she could react, the enormous trunk slammed down onto the hood of her beloved vehicle with a thunderous bang. Metal crunched under the weight, glass shattered, and the once immaculate convertible was instantly reduced to a mangled wreck. The impact sent shockwaves through the neighborhood, both literal and figurative. Dust rose into the air, mingling, with fragments of leaves and debris scattered across the scene. The silence that followed was deafening. Neighbors who had been watching cautiously from their porches or behind curtains now stepped forward, unable to contain their astonishment. Some covered their mouths in disbelief, while others exchanged wide-eyed looks. A few couldn't help but chuckle nervously, though they quickly stifled their laughter when they saw the murderous glare on Karen's face. Even those who had disliked her meddling couldn't deny that this was a spectacle unlike anything they'd ever witnessed. Karen dropped the chainsaw, its motor sputtering to a halt as the tool clattered noisily onto the pavement. Her hands trembled as she stared at the wreckage of her car, her jaw hanging open in utter disbelief. For a woman who prided herself on control and perfection, this was nothing short of a nightmare. Tears welled up in her eyes, not just from anger, but also from the crushing realization that her actions had led directly to this disaster. She had wanted to fix a problem, but instead, she had created one far worse than anything she had imagined. Across the street, Ben's house remained quiet, unaware of the drama unfolding outside. His absence added an almost surreal layer to the situation, as though fate itself had conspired to ensure he wouldn't be around to witness Karen's downfall. Meanwhile, the rest of the neighborhood buzzed with activity. Parents ushered curious children back inside, whispering about how they'd never seen anything quite like this before. Dogs barked excitedly, drawn by the commotion, while birds that had fled during the collapse slowly returned, chirping hesitantly as they surveyed the damage. One brave neighbor finally approached Karen, tentatively asking if she was okay. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern but also a hint of amusement he couldn't fully suppress. Karen didn't respond immediately. She just stood there staring blankly at the ruined car, her face a mixture of rage, embarrassment, and despair. When she finally spoke, her words came out in a shaky stammer. This isn't my fault," she muttered. more to herself than to anyone else. That tree should have been cut down years ago. This is Ben's doing. Her attempt to shift blame fell flat. Several witnesses standing nearby exchanged knowing glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief. One woman, bold enough to speak, said gently but firmly, "Karen, we all saw what happened. You were the one cutting the tree, there's no denying it." Her tone wasn't accusatory, but it carried a clear message. The truth was undeniable, and there was no use pretending otherwise. Karen's face flushed red with humiliation. She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again, realizing how futile her protests would be. The evidence was right there in front of everyone. The toppled tree, the crushed car, the chainsaw lying abandoned on the ground. She felt exposed, vulnerable, and utterly defeated. For someone who thrived on being in charge and having the upper hand, this was a devastating blow to her ego. As news of the incident spread, more neighbors gathered to gawk at the scene. Some brought cameras or phones, documenting the aftermath for posterity. Others simply stood quietly, shaking their heads in disbelief. A few offered sarcastic comments under their breath, though loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Guess the HOA president got a little too hands-on today," one man quipped, earning a round of muffled laughter from the crowd. Another joked, "Well, at least the sidewalk is clear now." Despite the light-hearted remarks, there was an underlying sense of unease. Everyone knew this incident would have lasting repercussions, not just for Karen but for the entire neighborhood. Amid the chaos, someone called the local authorities to report the accident. Within minutes, police cars and emergency vehicles arrived, their flashing lights casting a surreal glow over the scene. Officers cordoned off the area with yellow tape, ensuring no one ventured too close to the unstable tree or the wreckage below. Firefighters inspected the damage, making sure the fallen oak posed no further risk to property or people. Meanwhile, a representative from the city's Parks Department arrived to assess whether any additional hazards needed addressing. Throughout it all, Karen remained glued to the spot, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, as if trying to shield herself from the judgmental stares of her neighbors. Every question from the authorities, "Who gave you permission to cut this tree? Do you realize the danger you put yourself and others in?" only deepened her mortification. She answered haltingly, her usual confidence replaced by defensiveness. "I was just trying to make the neighborhood safer," she insisted repeatedly, though her arguments sounded hollow even to her own ears. By the time the initial cleanup efforts began, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the street. The once pristine neighborhood now bore the scars of Karen's reckless decision: a flattened car, a demolished tree, and a community left reeling from the absurdity of it all. As the day drew to a close, the neighbors dispersed, leaving Karen alone with her thoughts and the wreckage she had created. What had started as a simple act of defiance had spiraled into something far beyond her control, and the consequences were only beginning to unfold. When Ben finally returned home later that afternoon, he was completely unaware of the chaos that awaited him. His weekend visit with family had been peaceful and enjoyable, a much-needed break from work and the usual routines of life. As he turned onto his street, humming along to a song on the radio, he noticed an unusual number of cars parked haphazardly along the curb. At first, he thought maybe there was a block party or some kind of neighborhood gathering. But as he drove closer, the scene unfolding in front of his house made his jaw drop. The massive oak tree that had stood proudly in his yard for decades was gone. Well, not entirely gone, but it certainly wasn't where it was supposed to be. Instead, its enormous trunk lay sprawled across the street, crushing Karen's shiny red convertible beneath it. Splintered branches were scattered everywhere, and yellow caution tape surrounded the area like a crime scene. Neighbors lingered nearby, chatting animatedly and pointing at the wreckage. Some waved awkwardly when they saw Ben pull up, unsure how to explain what had happened. Ben stepped out of his car, confusion written all over his face. What is going on here?" he asked aloud, though no one seemed eager to answer. It was Karen who broke the silence, storming toward him with fire in her eyes. "This is your fault," she shouted. jabbing a finger at him accusingly. Her voice trembled with anger, embarrassment, and desperation. "If you hadn't ignored my warnings about that stupid tree, none of this would have happened." Ben blinked, trying to process what she was saying. "Wait, my fault? I wasn't even here today," he replied calmly, though inside his mind was racing. He glanced around at the crowd, searching for answers. That's when several neighbors stepped forward, hesitant at first but eventually speaking up. One woman recounted how she'd seen Karen wielding a chainsaw earlier that day, hacking away at the base of the tree. Another mentioned hearing loud noises and seeing Karen standing near the trunk moments before it fell. Piece by piece, the story came together, painting a clear picture of what had transpired. Karen's face turned redder with each revelation, her attempts to deflect blame growing increasingly desperate. "I was doing everyone a favor," she insisted, her voice rising shrilly. "That tree was dangerous. Someone could have gotten hurt." But her protests fell flat. The evidence was undeniable: the fallen tree, the ruined car, and the very tool she had used, a chainsaw, now lying abandoned on the pavement. Even the HOA president, who arrived shortly after hearing about the incident, couldn't hide his exasperation. "Karen," he said firmly, shaking his head, "you can't just go cutting down someone else's property without permission. You've caused significant damage to Ben's tree, to your own car, and to the community as a whole." He gestured toward the mess, emphasizing the scope of the destruction. "This isn't how we handle things in the neighborhood." The confrontation escalated quickly, with Karen refusing to take responsibility for her actions. She continued to insist that Ben should have known the tree was unsafe and that she was merely acting in the best interest of the HOA. Ben, however, remained calm throughout the exchange, choosing instead to focus on finding solutions rather than assigning blame. "Look," he said evenly, addressing both Karen and the HOA president, "the tree is gone now, and obviously there's a lot of cleanup to do. Let's figure out how to move forward." The HOA president nodded in agreement. After consulting with the authorities and assessing the situation, he declared that Karen would be responsible for covering the costs of cleanup and repairs, not just for her car, but also for any damages to Ben's property. This decision sent shockwaves through Karen, whose face went pale at the realization of the financial burden she now faced. Cleanup crews would need to remove the fallen tree, repair the sidewalk, and address potential hazards left behind by the collapse. On top of that, Ben's yard would require landscaping to fill the void left by the missing oak. But the consequences didn't stop there. Word of Karen's reckless behavior spread quickly through the neighborhood, becoming the topic of conversation at every dinner table and backyard barbecue. While some neighbors sympathized with her frustration over the tree, most agreed that her actions were wildly inappropriate and unnecessary. Her reputation within the HOA took a nosedive, and she found herself increasingly isolated. Members began questioning her leadership abilities, pointing out that her impulsive decision-making had caused more harm than good. Soon enough, whispers turned into open criticism, and Karen's authority as the head of the HOA crumbled. For Ben, the aftermath of the incident brought mixed emotions. On one hand, he mourned the loss of his beloved tree, which had been a cherished part of his home for years. Its absence left a noticeable gap in his yard, both visually and emotionally. On the other hand, he couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. For months, Karen had harassed him about the tree, making unfounded claims and filing complaints that disrupted his peace. Now, her own actions had proven her wrong in the most dramatic way possible. Determined to make the best of the situation, Ben decided to take action. With the help of a local arborist, he selected a smaller, safer tree to plant in place of the old oak. This time, he installed a discreet sign labeling it as a protected feature of his landscaping, hoping to avoid future conflicts. He also reached out to the HOA board to discuss ways to improve communication and prevent similar incidents from happening again. His willingness to collaborate and find common ground earned him newfound respect among his neighbors, many of whom admired his level-headedness during such a chaotic time. As for Karen, the fallout was far-reaching. Not only did she lose credibility within the HOA, but she also became something of a pariah in the neighborhood. People whispered about her behind her back, recounting the story of the tree fiasco, with a mix of disbelief and amusement. Her once pristine flower beds began to show signs of neglect, as if mirroring her declining status in the community. Eventually, unable to bear the constant reminders of her humiliation, Karen put her house on the market and moved away, leaving behind a legacy of overzealousness and poor judgment. The neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief when she was gone. Life slowly returned to normal, though the memory of the fallen tree and the crushed convertible lingered as a cautionary tale. Neighbors often joked about the incident during casual conversations, using it as a reminder of the importance of patience, humility, and thinking twice before taking drastic action. For Ben, the experience reinforced his belief in staying true to himself and trusting his instincts, even when faced with pressure from others. And for the rest of the community, it served as a lesson that sometimes stepping back and letting nature take its course is the wisest choice of all. In the weeks that followed Karen's dramatic exit from the neighborhood, life began to settle into a new rhythm. The fallen oak tree was cleared away, its massive trunk and branches hauled off in pieces by a team of workers. The sidewalk was repaired, smooth and unblemished once again, as if the chaos had never occurred. Ben's yard, however, still bore the scar of losing its towering centerpiece. The empty space where the oak once stood felt almost eerie, casting long shadows during sunrise and sunset that reminded everyone of what used to be there. Determined to fill the void, Ben planted a young dogwood tree in the same spot. It was small and delicate compared to the mighty oak, but it carried a quiet charm of its own. Its branches were adorned with soft pink blossoms that swayed gently in the breeze, adding a touch of color and life to his yard. To avoid future disputes, Ben installed a small sign next to the tree that read, "Protected tree, for the joy of our community." He hoped this gesture would discourage anyone else from trying to meddle with his landscaping choices. Neighbors who walked past couldn't help but smile at the sight of the new addition. Some even stopped to compliment Ben on his choice, saying how much they appreciated seeing something beautiful grow in place of the old tree. Meanwhile, Karen's sudden departure left a noticeable gap in the neighborhood dynamics. Her absence wasn't mourned. It was more like a collective sigh of relief. People no longer worried about receiving passive-aggressive notes in their mailboxes or being scolded for minor infractions like mismatched curtains or slightly overgrown grass. The HOA meetings, which Karen had dominated for years, became noticeably calmer and more collaborative. A new president was elected, someone who prioritized listening to residents' concerns rather than enforcing rigid rules. Slowly but surely, the atmosphere in the community shifted from tense and judgmental to warm and welcoming. Of course, the story of the tree incident didn't fade quietly into obscurity. Instead, it took on a life of its own, becoming the stuff of local legend. At block parties, holiday gatherings, and casual get-togethers, neighbors loved retelling the tale with varying degrees of embellishment. One version claimed that Karen had worn a superhero cape while wielding the chainsaw, determined to save the neighborhood single-handedly. Another joked that the tree had whispered ominous warnings before falling, giving Karen plenty of time to reconsider her actions, if only she'd listened. No matter how it was told, the story always ended with laughter and nods of agreement that karma had truly come full circle. For Ben, the experience brought unexpected benefits. His calm demeanor during the aftermath earned him widespread respect among his neighbors. Many saw him as a voice of reason and fairness, qualities that were sorely needed after Karen's reign of micromanagement. When an opportunity arose to join the HOA board, several neighbors encouraged him to apply. Though initially hesitant, Ben eventually agreed, viewing it as a chance to contribute positively to the community he cared so much about. His approachable nature and willingness to compromise quickly made him a favorite among members, further solidifying his role as a leader within the neighborhood. As months turned into seasons, the dogwood tree flourished under Ben's care. Its roots grew stronger, and its blossoms returned each spring, brighter and more vibrant than the year before. Children in the neighborhood began referring to it as Ben's magic tree, claiming it brought good luck to anyone who stood beneath it. Parents smiled at the nickname, knowing it symbolized a fresh start, a reminder that even after loss and conflict, growth and renewal were always possible. Karen, on the other hand, faded into obscurity. Rumors circulated that she had moved to a gated community far away, one with strict rules and zero tolerance for individuality. Whether these stories were true or not, no one could say for sure. What mattered most was that her presence no longer loomed over the neighborhood like a storm cloud. In her absence, people felt freer to express themselves without fear of judgment. Gardens became more colorful, front porches more inviting, and conversations more genuine. The incident also sparked broader discussions about the importance of balance in communal living. While maintaining standards was important, many realized that rigidity often led to resentment and division. By embracing flexibility and understanding, the neighborhood discovered a newfound sense of harmony. Differences were celebrated rather than criticized, and conflicts were resolved through dialogue instead of confrontation. Looking back, Ben often reflected on how much had changed since that fateful Saturday morning. Losing the oak tree had been painful, but it had also opened doors to unexpected opportunities. It taught him and everyone else that sometimes the greatest lessons come from the most unlikely places. The story of Karen and the fallen tree served as a powerful reminder that pride and stubbornness rarely lead to positive outcomes, while patience and humility can pave the way for healing and growth. Years later, when newcomers asked about the history of the neighborhood, longtime residents would inevitably bring up the tale of the HOA president who tried to cut down a tree and ended up destroying her own car instead. They'd laugh, shake their heads, and share the moral of the story. Don't let your ego blind you to reason or gravity. And as they spoke, they'd glance fondly at Ben's dogwood tree, now tall and strong, standing as a symbol of resilience, forgiveness, and the enduring beauty of second chances.